Now, when you were in seminary, you mentioned in your book that you carried, you're really interested in the Bible, you're interested in Greek and Hebrew, and you studied it and you got so you could work with it real good, but you carried around in your backpack as a student a lot of lexicons and Hebrew lexicons, Greek lexicons, and the Testaments, and you don't do that anymore.
No, I don't have to. I used to. In fact, a friend of mine was reading my book just the other day, and his name is Dan, and he said, "David, I remember that. Oh man, we come to chapel, we called it convocation, and I'd be handing out books to everybody else, and I'd be sitting there with my Greek, and I would get to the point where I'd literally, in later years, even after I got my Master of Divinity and got ordained and all that stuff, to where I would sit there with all these Greek texts open before me and all these linguistic keys and Metzger and all this Bible Society stuff, trying to figure out what words in a verse I could actually believe and which version of them I could actually trust. I had to hold every belief tentatively because I believed what my teachers taught me instead of learning what history said.
And what did history say?
History said is God is consistent and He has preserved His words. He kept His promise.
So your position is, and you tell people that the only Bible they should read if they are readers of English is the King James Version. Is that right?
Yes, because of two things I told you. Because it is those accurately transmitted texts through history and the accurately transmitted meanings of the words through history.
Well, is there anything wrong with reading something like Moffat's paraphrase or Ken Taylor's Living Bible? I mean, is that going to hurt us? Don't you get the idea out of what it says there? I mean, you're a linguist. You know what equivalency is. What do they call it? What is it? Translational equivalence or something instead of word by word?
Dynamic equivalence.
Yeah, dynamic.
Or functional equivalence.
Well, what's wrong with these other versions? How are they going to hurt us? Can they help us at all?
They can hurt your faith when you find the inconsistencies between them. When you have again, this book is only about what's missing. I want to keep on bringing the reader to understand this. I'm not talking about what's changed at this point. If I bring it out in this broadcast, it's only to answer your questions. But what I want you to hear is if a pastor's standing up, and let's say he's reading from one version, and he moves that aside and said, you know what, and he pulls up another Bible. Yeah, I like the way the Message Bible says it. I like the way the ESV says it here. And this is what you should hear. So wait a second. I'm sitting in the pew, and I'm saying, is he asking me to change my life on the basis of a version or a verse he likes better than another? Am I going to have to call him anytime I read a verse to decide which version I should read that verse from?
Yes.
Or is God more consistent than that I can go and every verse I can say, thus saith the Lord? That's the Lord's words to me. You see, there's a trick the devil has done from the very beginning. What are the first words he ever said in the Bible? Yea, hath God said? The very first words. And you know what he got? He brought doubt into the mind of Eve. But you know what? It's not wrong to have doubts in your mind or questions in your mind. But what happened next is where the big sin happened. She didn't go back to God and say, yeah, God, did you say that? We can't have every tree in the garden? No. She turned back to the serpent and listened to him. And that's what modern scholars and publishers do to us. They tell us, yea, hath God said, and then they tell us to look at their own footnotes while they try to hem and haw and come up with what they like in their version.
Now, you say in your book, I think this is on page 134, that while you were studying at the Summer Institute of Linguistics at Wycliffe, that the quotation from Martin Luther grabbed you. And
Absolutely.
I want to read that if I can real quick.
Please do.
If I profess with loudest voice, this is Martin Luther speaking, if I profess with loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldiers proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is merely flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. Now, why did that grab you so much?
It grabs me because it's a battlefield scene. And, you know, my grandfather was in the Navy. My grandfather on the other side of the family was the first one to enlist in his area for World War I. They cared about their country and fighting for it. You know, when the battle rages, that's where all the pressure is. And too many Christians buckle at the point of pressure. And what Martin Luther became clear on is it doesn't matter if everywhere else you're a good soldier, if you let the enemy win at the one point where he's actually attacking you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a great shoe shiner, that's great, but when the enemy is there and has a bayonet pointed at you, you've got to do something then.
And
the bayonet right now is, yea, hath God said.
There are so many versions, English versions of the Bible now, that I'm lost. 25 years ago, I knew probably most of them. They tell me a new one comes out every year.
About every 2 years, yes.
Every 2 years. But I don't know what can be done about it, but the King James Bible, of course, as were even the Latin Vulgate in the early centuries, weren't those put together so that there would be a uniform or a consistency and people would understand and learn a Bible and there wouldn't be so much contention in the church? They'd learn it from the same version. Wasn't that the reason for those?
Yeah, even James himself, if we're when it came time when the Puritans were petitioning him in 1604 to on a number of different topics, and one of them was the proposition of making a new Bible that would be consistent with the Hebrew and Greek, because the ones that were around were not that good. He said, yeah, and I want this one read in the church. When this is done, I want this one read in the church and no other. Mm-hmm. He wanted one Bible so that people would have one consistent idea that would not have a bunch of man's notes all over it. The only exception as far as man's notes has to do with translators' notes and objections. After going through the text no less than 14 times from 1604 to 1610, actually more 1606 to 1610, but there was a process. After going over the text no less than 14 times, if anybody kept on their objection, that was put into a center note. So I give them no credence whatsoever. I don't pay attention to those ors when you see them in the notes, but that was a way of being straight with the people who still had objections, but the rest was kept in the text. That means that 54 plus people had to be in agreement on every word out of 1,189 chapters of the Bible.
Now there were two long passages I noticed in your book you say are eliminated or omitted from most every version. These passages are familiar to anybody that's been in church for very long. One of them is the narrative of the woman caught in adultery.
Yes.
In John chapter 7 through most of John chapter 8, am I remembering
John
right?
7:53 to 8:11, to be specific, 12 verses.
And that's taken out of almost all of the major new verses, new
there's
versions.
Different ways to do it, as I say in the book, and I want to make this very, very clear. And you will find this, as I have found it, even after I wrote the book. I was surprised. So let me backtrack something. There are 3 different ways or 4 different ways to say you don't believe something but have it a Bible published. One is to omit it entirely, so it's literally physically not in the book. You can't find it anywhere.
Okay.
Number 2 is to stick it in a footnote. Number 3 is to put it in italics. Number 4 is to put it in brackets. And actually, there is a 5th one. Number 5 is to separate the text off and then just write a little note on it.
Yes.
Separate it so it's a part or paragraph over or something like that. You block the text out. All those ways, and you can read the introduction to a Bible, always read the introduction, to find out which one it is, are ways of the translators and the publishers saying, we don't believe these words, but we figure you're probably not going to buy our Bible unless we have it.
So these new translations, in your view, are a matter of money?
Well, I thought you were going to put a ... on there. It is. I have just been able to back up a multi-billion-dollar industry. Think about this, Brent. Most people in the past, and I have some at home, had family Bibles and personal Bibles. They would have one Bible through their lives. But what happens if you find out that you can get people to rebuy things like they do clothing, or computers? Every couple of years you have a new upgraded edition, and then you set aside the old one, you buy a new one, then you buy a new concordance that's keyed to it, a new dictionary that's keyed to it, new maps and outlines that are keyed to it, then the newest popular fun book that's keyed to it and has all the verses from it. It's multi-billions of dollars.